Welcome to Revolutionary Ideas, the monthly Marxist podcast from Socialist Alternative. Socialists believe in changing the world. This wouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, but what is our deeper philosophy of change? The Marxist philosophy of dialectical materialism can be a daunting place to start for many. Engels' classic works, like Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, as well as Dialectics of Nature, are both classic expositions of this theory. But in this episode, our regular panellists, Connor and Yara, will be speaking to Dave Jones, a socialist alternative activist in Merseyside, to discuss the relevance of these ideas for us today and how we can begin to get our heads around it. Without further ado, I'll pass on to you three.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Revolutionary Ideas. This is episode 9 of our podcast, and we are here with Dave Jones. So I want to ask you first, I guess it's a very broad question, but I think this kind of theory from Marx's thought is the main thing that people talk about when they talk about the philosophy behind Marxism. So what is it? What does it actually mean?
Yeah, I mean, dialectical materialism is the philosophy that underpins Marxism. And basically, it's a coming together of two schools of philosophy, dialectics and materialism. And it was Marx that first pulled those two different schools of thought or types of thought, trends of thought together to come up with a new way of analysing the world and interpreting it.
You know, that's a good point. And obviously there's these kind of two ideas, dialectics and materialism. And I think dialectics is not necessarily a term that you'd hear outside of these kinds of discussions in kind of everyday life. But essentially it's this point that everything's always changing, and people who are interested in dialectics are looking at processes. They're interested in kind of looking at how things change. And to go back to pretty much the first dialectical kind of philosopher, who was an ancient Greek philosopher called Heraclitus, he said that you can never jump in the same river twice. The river's always changing slightly, you're always changing slightly. And it's about looking at, how these things change, acknowledging that things never kind of stay in this kind of state of kind of eternally being static. And you know, I think that that's a really important way to make sure that we're looking at the world. Yeah,
and I think just in terms of that as well, I mean, looking at dialectics, I mean, the actual word comes from an old Greek word, and my pronunciation might not be great here, dialego, which is basically about looking at a problem or a question from all different angles, testing it out, probing it, if you like, to come to a rounded out solution or answer. And I think that's very much ties in with, you know, how we look at the processes within society to try and get that rounded out view of events rather than just a static view. That static view is the opposite to the way Marxists interpret the world and look at it.
Yeah, I think there's always kind of like the dichotomy between kind of metaphysics and kind of seeing the static versus dialectics and seeing the processes. And I think it was Trotsky who compared it to looking at a picture versus looking at the actual world or looking at a film. And I think it's really important to think about it, because I don't think we kind of reject metaphysics altogether. It's useful in some cases to look at to pause time for a second and inspect something as it is at one particular moment in time. But I think the point that you made about how dialectics is about looking at everything from every angle is particularly important, because when you look at one moment in time, even if you look at all of the angles, you're missing what brought this moment on and where this moment is going. And I think that is something that's really big for Marxists. I think, you know, there's always this kind of joke about Marxists about how we only care about predicting the future, and we have this crystal ball that you always look into, but it all comes down to this philosophy, to the philosophy of inspecting something in its movement. And when you inspect something in its movement, you also look at where it's going and where it's headed, and you're able to make actual predictions that in a lot of cases come true. And I think it was Trotsky who made the point that it doesn't matter if this theory is 100 or in our case 200 years old. If it's the theory that manages to get actual predictions about history, then it's the most modern theory of all.
Yeah, and I think that is so true. It is about not being tied down to when a theory developed. It's around how it's applied today, and looking at those processes is so important. One of the I think it was an article that Trotsky wrote, that it might have been the title of the article, or the title of a paragraph, that the statement he made around the superiority of foresight over astonishment. And I think that is so important. And it's not that we haven't got, there's no Marxist crystal ball sat in the corner of our rooms here. But it is about analysing what possibly may happen and looking at how society may develop, and not caught unawares, because you do see people getting caught unawares too often. People with all the right ideas, how many people got so convinced that Corbyn must win the last election, and when he didn't, they were stunned. They were literally stunned and didn't know how to react. Or when the Tories win an election, being stunned. Having that foresight hopefully counteracts that stunning effect, at least upon the leading layers.
Yeah, I think dialectics is obviously something that is very useful for us. So what's the other half of this? We're talking about dialectical materialism. What's materialism? Marxists all really obsessed with having lots of, nice things and that sort of stuff.
We're just material girls in a material world, aren't we?
It's funny because the use of language is always interesting, and idealism is perhaps in common language is seen as a more positive thing than materialism. It is the idea. Materialism in sort of everyday language can be seen as being fascinated with getting the latest trinket or the latest gadget and focused on getting on in the world, a sense of greed, if you like. And idealism in that everyday sense is about, being principled somehow, maybe a bit naive, but being principled. When actually, when you look at it from a scientific point of view, I think the positions are reversed. And materialism is more around being based in the world itself, recognizing that everything is knowable in this world and that the world exists independently of us. Whereas for idealists, it's the opposite way around. The unknowable is a key aspect to idealism, with religion explaining everything that we don't know. And actually that somehow the world doesn't exist independently of us. So it's sort of flipped upon its head when you're talking in more scientific terms.
Yeah, I think, it can kind of seem like quite a kind of lofty academic point, this idea of materialism versus idealism. But really, when you look at how that comes into practice, I think it's very clearly actually not such an academic kind of question. You will see people that would, use religious arguments behind their politics and that kind of thing, which of course we wouldn't. But even, more kind of grounded ideas like, you'd see a lot of idealists talking about history being made by great men or of kind of big ideas, but Marxists don't see it that way. We'd look at the material factors, the economics, the social relations, forces in society, things like class struggle, and base our understanding on that. And I think that's, a really crucial difference.
Yeah, and I think, when you look at how Marx applied materialism, and in one of his pamphlets, The German Ideology, he talked about how people are conditioned by the development of the productive forces around them, and stated that, consciousness can never be anything other than conscious existence. And existence is about the actual life process. And therefore your consciousness expands as the conditions develop and the knowledge grows. That's what gives us the potential to organise society based on where we are now, and to use the technology as it's developed to this stage, to organise it in a way appropriate to our time.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and I think, again, another cliche said about Marxists is we always talk about, the objective conditions, the material conditions, but it's not an academic term. It's we're looking at the world and we're seeing that change happens in people because of the situation that they're in. It's not some kind of ethereal kind of change in their mind. It comes down to the experiences that they have in their lives, which come down to the way that society is organized, to the way that they actually live the actual material life. And I think the combination of kind of dialectics and materialism is a great way to actually kind of look at things throughout history and see how that happens. So I think the point that Connor made before about how there's this perception that history moves through great men. There's this, again, cliche of the kind of liberal thought that the First World War started because of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. But we, as Marxists, are going to point at the processes that brought to the point where this one thing that triggered it wasn't actually one thing. It was just a whole lot of things that kind of culminated. And I think that kind of brings me on to another question that I wanted to ask you. We talk a lot about the contradictions in Marxism, the contradictions in history, and I wanted to ask you, what does that mean, and how does that connect to dialectical materialism?
Yeah, I think when we look at society, in fact, when we look at all elements of life, you can look at the natural world in a similar sort of basis. But when we look at society, there are competing forces at play. For the longest time, for certainly longer than I can care to remember, there's been conflicting classes within our society. And those classes will regularly conflict. You can see that in a workplace where the manager wants, to increase the production rates. The worker doesn't want to wear himself out, and you get that constant sort of clashing, to repeat that word, taking place. And through that, you find a level of development that comes from that. You reach a new stage. So you, in terms of the workplace, you will reach an agreement with the manager of how the work will be organised at that time. But that the next day, the manager is going to want to push back, and the worker is going to want to push forward. And that clash will start all over again. And I think it's those two different opposite forces, working class and ruling class in this example, constantly coming together, battering heads, if you like, reaching a temporary solution, and then the next day starting all over again.
Yeah, I think that's important. Yeah, it happens through these contradictions. And they're really like the motive force of the change, and to see how things change. And also because we do want to try and work out in advance what direction things are going, we have to look at the forces that drive the change, have to kind of lift up the bonnet of the kind of vehicle of society and look at the inner workings of it. And only on that basis can we, really kind of get that kind of deeper understanding. And as you said, like, the real kind of fundamental contradiction that Marx was looking at was the contradictions that there were between the working class who produced the wealth in society and produced the surplus of that wealth, and the capitalists who want to take control of as much as that surplus as possible. And, we can see the results of that in things like austerity in recent years, but also, on the other hand, the fights back against the establishment from the working class, which isn't always totally black and white. But I think when we look at things like Brexit, the Corbyn movement, and all of these kinds of things, we can definitely see where they come from if we look at it like that. And, these have both been issues that you've seen the kind of liberal establishment being utterly kind of confused over why these things have come about. Well, it's very clear for us.
Yeah, and I think it's also important, I think, to recognise the impact or the effect an outside agency can have upon the situation. So you've got the two forces competing, and there can be a sort of equilibrium. What can upset that sort of equilibrium that stops it just seesawing backwards and forwards, but becomes a significant change that takes place? Those external forces can be quite small. If you're looking at a workplace, a small factory, it could be a change in the Bank of England interest rates that affect that. It can be much broader. One thing I think we need to be aware of now as a potential agent for change, of course, is the COVID pandemic. That is something that hasn't applied within society, certainly for some period of time within the Western society, if you like, the G7 sort of nations. But that is something that's an external agency that could affect a real change. Now, we'll see how that develops, but it will certainly have an impact. We're seeing the slogans sort of coming out of no going back to normal. And the potential is there for that, having that qualitative change.
Yeah, and I think COVID is a really good example of what we mean when we say material conditions as well, because it's something that is natural in a way. It's something that had no basis in ideas. It was just something that happened. But the way that it impacts the world is dialectical. It's the way that humans are dealing with this pandemic, the way that humans are dealing with the virus in the first place to make it into a pandemic, and then the way that we've been dealing with lockdowns, with the vaccine, the way that we see how there's this, again, contradiction, this clash between the ruling class and the working class, the people who are paying for this and the people who can shield themselves from it. And I think that really leads me well into kind of the base of the processes of change in society, which according to Marx, according to Engels, according to dialectical materialism, are the working class and are the class struggle. There's this famous sentence from the Communist Manifesto about how the history of everything is the history of class struggle. And we are going to talk about that particular piece of writing in the next episode, in episode 10 next month. But I think that it's really important to explain kind of why Marx is saying that, history is all about the contradiction between the ruling class and the working class, that the history is class struggle.
Yeah, I mean, I think for so long, since the turn of the Industrial Revolution, we've seen the development of the working class. And of course, inherent within the ideas of capitalism is that the way in which capitalism, the bosses survive and prosper, is by trying to take as much of the working class as possible, almost, to leave us enough to live. And little more than that, if they could get away from it. Whereas from the working class's point of view, we want a better standard of living. We want to take back as much as our own, the value we brought to society. We want as much as that for ourselves as a class. Well, ideally, all of it, which will be the overthrow of capitalism. And I think it's that that's led to that class struggle over the last 200, 300 years.
This point about class struggles really interesting, I think, because for those of us that have been out on the picket lines or at a protest and this kind of thing, it might seem very strange to be talking about philosophy, this very kind of abstract subject as it's known to be. And not something that might seem immediately obvious when you're out there on the street. But for Marxists, this is something that we see as very important. So I think it's worth discussing. What use does dialectical materialism have for us as activists, for us as campaigners and organisers in the movement, in the class struggle? And how will it actually help us build that struggle.
Yeah, it's interesting because you could say, well, what relevance is philosophy? We just want to get a better pay rise. And you could make the same sort of argument about mathematics. Well, who needs to know about mathematics? That's just a complicated science. But actually, it comes to, what percentage pay rise you want. It's exactly the same with philosophy in terms of the dialectical materialism. It helps us understand the processes. I'm a union rep, and I think you need to understand the mood of the workers you're standing alongside, the mood of the class on a broader level. Where is their consciousness at? Are they at the stage where they're ready to walk off the job and say we've had enough, or are they in the position where they think, well, we've got no chance here, because you cannot be detached from the rest of the working class, and it's understanding exactly where people are at on that day, and that will change on a day-to-day basis and on a month-to-month basis. You can have a ballot for a strike action one day and you lose it. The next day you could go in, something will have changed. Who knows what that may be, and the result will be different.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point, because I think, we started with this quote about how you can never go into the same river twice. And I think it's very clear when you go to a protest, it almost never feels the same. Even from as a person going to the protests, you see the differences in consciousness, especially when you're talking about picket line of a long kind of industrial action. You can see the way that the consciousness of workers changes as the struggle progresses. And I think that's obviously like a micro example of this bigger process in society, of the way that the working class interprets the way that the world works. And I think that is why this philosophy has to get in there, because we are not just talking about philosophy in a classroom, just thinking about what moves the world. We are using that philosophy in the struggle to progress the struggle and to kind of get it to a point where it's winning something and progresses history, like Marx was saying.
I think the key word or little phrase that used in that for me was around progressing the struggle, because of course as Marxists we're not sort of passive observers, just taking a note of the mood of the working class, but we are actors on the stage of history, and we can influence events. It's quite right to say that great men, or indeed great women, can't alone change society, but you can have an impact. Lenin could not have willed the Russian Revolution to have happened, however strong his will was. However, when the circumstances were right, he can influence and take advantage of those situations. And that's what we're doing on a much smaller scale. I can never pretend to operate on such a grand scale as Lenin did. But on a very small scale, it's about how we can affect those changes, know the mood of people, and know when to say, right, let's do something. Let's take this action. It's getting that instinctive feel of when is the right moment to act.
I think this point that we've come to, really, that Marxist theory is a guide to action, is really important. And in fact, if you divorce it from the action, you've really only got half of what this philosophy is about, because the whole point of it is that, these are ideas to build the fight to change the system. And we can see from history, the fight to change the system. Actually, you look at the Russian Revolution, it wasn't led by those who started with bombs, but as it said, it was led by those who started with dialectics. The Bolsheviks in Russia, obviously Lenin among them, led the Russian Revolution, but they did that on the basis of the understanding of society, the understanding of the way class struggle works, and how that can be driven to to kind of revolutionary conclusions, and how it can be directed to overthrow capitalism. And I think that's why we talk about this so much, isn't it? Because it's a tool for actually helping us build that struggle to change society.
It absolutely is. It's not an academic exercise that we're involved in. Whether we're working on a small scale or a big scale, we are looking to change the world. The task in front of us is immense. It's about creating a new world, a new form of society, and that's not something that will happen easily. And that's where the importance of these ideas lies. And we need to be intelligent in our approach to the ideas, as we were discussing earlier. Lenin in left-wing communism said, in politics, it's absurd to concoct a general rule that would serve all cases. You've got to have the brain to analyze the situation in each individual case and then apply it in a much broader scale to bring about that real major change in society.
Yeah, and I think that point about kind of how class struggle is what changes society, and which is at the core of dialectical materialism, is really important, because when there's a struggle, when there's a protest, when there's a fight of working class people, there is this change in consciousness of realizing that what's happening right now is not good, that they're being exploited, that they're being discriminated against, oppressed. But to make this jump to the solution, you have to understand how society works, because I think it's again kind of like criticism that's like thrown at revolutionary socialists all the time, that we're utopian. We're thinking about kind of a society that is kind of like a paradise, but there's no way to get there because capitalism is the way. But when you look at this kind of theory of dialectical materialism, you look at the history and the way that the history has progressed, and you see that it's not always been like that. Class society hasn't existed forever, and even capitalism has existed for even less of that. And when you see how history changes, suddenly you can think, okay, so how do we change the way the history is going right now? How do we kind of go into this process? And when you realize that at the core of it all is class struggle, then revolutionary conclusions are basically the only way to go from there.
That's absolutely correct. And I'd just like to expand upon the point of class struggle, or it's to some degree to spell out something that's inherent within class struggle. Because I think flowing from the idea that we're based upon, our consciousness is based upon conditions in society, is a collective approach to changing things and how we act. And I think that's, in the core of Marxism, that we have a collective consciousness, a collective memory, but we have to have a collective action, moving away from just individual actions. And to a degree, when we talked about idealism before, idealism will focus on the individual, that it's all down upon the individual. Now, I'm not saying individual choices play no part in how society develops. We all make individual choices every day. But, I'm not poor because I spend all my money on satellite TVs or on fags and booze. That might be part of why I'm poor. But I'm poor because of the way society is organised and the level of my pay. And I'm not going to resolve that fundamentally, individually. Fundamentally, you're only going to resolve it by taking collective action.
I think that point about being poor is a really good one, because you could draw this to its logical conclusion. Some poor people might be poor because they spend all their money on these things and aren't very responsible with their money, or because they're lazy, is what we're often told, isn't it? That poor people are just kind of scroungers that haven't put in a decent day's work in their life. But actually, even in a hypothetical situation where every poor person in the whole world worked as hard as they could and lived like monks, you know, there'd still be poor people because society is organized on a basis where it needs people, you know, that are unemployed, people that are desperate for housing and, you know, need to sell their labor to make ends meet. And obviously, if that wasn't the case, then, you know, the world would be a much better place, but it's not like that. And that's why we have this philosophy. It's why we're talking about how to change society. And, you know, I think the kind of classic quote from Karl Marx himself about this actually is a good point to kind of bring up, that philosophers up to now have only interpreted the world, but the point is to change it, which is obviously what we're trying to do in the Socialist Alternative. We don't just kind of sit here and talk about dialectics and talk about workers on the picket lines and stuff. We're out there supporting struggle and building struggle, and in many cases leading struggle as well, and fighting for that change, because as has been mentioned, it's something that, you know, isn't just going to happen just from willing it. We've got to kind of actively go out and build that and fight for that change.
I think it's also important to say that this theory did not come out of books and sitting in a university hall. It came out of being part of the struggle. When Marx said it, he didn't just say it because he liked the sound of it. But it's because this philosophy came from him and Engels being involved in those struggles, seeing the conditions that workers have been in, talking to the workers, seeing how their consciousness has changed, and studied history to see how we got to that point and how we're going to change it, and actively involve themselves in the attempts to change it.
I think that's, you know, that's so true. And I think it's important to take the time to look at what's going on in society, you know, and to read and to study. That's I don't want to downplay that, but if that's all you're doing, you're going to fall short. You're going to be that passive observer. You have got to be, to coin a phrase, be out in the streets. Now, of course, I'm speaking generally. There are people, because of their individual circumstances, you know, who aren't going to be able to literally be out on the streets. But collectively, that's where we need to be. At the moment, collectively, we might all be sat in bedrooms reading and studying. But that's only while we're in lockdown. You know, we know that we need to spend a part of time learning and studying. But we will learn much more by being out in the streets, affecting actual change.
Yeah, and I think this is a great point to finish on, because we are not sitting here in our respective bedrooms talking about philosophy because we enjoy talking about philosophy, even though it's very interesting, don't get me wrong. We're doing it because this is what prepares us to go out on the streets, and we have to have the best of both worlds. We have to have the theory to back us when we go out on the streets and when we struggle and when we organize to fight against the system and to progress this class struggle. But we are not going to do it just by learning theory. We have to go and combine this theory and praxis together. So thank you so much, Dave. And before we all go, I want to urge anyone who's heard this and was convinced by this theory from about 200 years ago that come and don't just sit around in your room and listen to us talk about it. Come and actually join us and discuss this with us. And when it's possible, come out in the streets and fight together with us and workers, youth, and everyone who is oppressed by this system. So thank you so much, Dave. Thank you, Connor. And hope to see you next month for another episode of Revolutionary Ideas.
Thanks to our three panellists for this excellent episode of Revolutionary Ideas. Make sure you subscribe and follow us on all of our platforms. More episodes will be coming monthly in 2021 and no doubt beyond then. Until then, make sure you follow us on our social media platforms. On Facebook, we're Socialist Alternative ISA England, Wales and Scotland. On Instagram, we're Socialist Alternative .ews. On Twitter, it's Socialist Alt EWS. And last but not least, on TikTok, It's socialist_vids. Thanks for listening. We hope to see you next month when we'll be discussing the Communist Manifesto. See you then.